Welcome to the 13th fiction in our 15 Fictions for Summer series. Today, I'm talking about Alan Hollinghurst's wonderful novel about gay life in Thatcher's Britain, The Line of Beauty. The Line of Beauty begins with a scene in which the main character, who is a young man called Nick Guest, goes into a bookshop in London in the autumn of 1983, and he gets a book which is called Landslide. It's called Landslide! And it's a hack work. It's been a hastily published book by some Tory hack celebrating the great Thatcher landslide that had taken place a few months earlier. And the reason that Nick Guest wants this book is because he has just moved to London and he's staying in the house of a Tory MP who got elected in that landslide. And he knows in the book there's a photograph of the new Thatcher intake from that election. And it includes this man, Gerald Fedden, who is a kind of classic Thatcherite Tory MP. He's good looking, he's ambitious, he's quite vulgar, as we're going to discover. And he is absolutely in his element in the age of the Thatcher landslide. The book ends just after the next election. So it ends in 1987, after what is sometimes called the second Thatcher landslide. Though two of the characters, Nick Guest and the daughter of Gerald Fedden, have a conversation about this. Nick Guest has, as we will discover, a very ambivalent relationship with this household. What was he doing there in 1983? He was a guest. He's called Nick Guest because he's a kind of house guest. He was a friend of Gerald Fedden's son, Toby. They were friends at Oxford, and he'd somehow come to London to do a PhD, needed somewhere to live. So he lives in this house. It's a grand house. It's in Notting Hill. He's not just a guest. It's clear early on. He's also there as a kind of minder because the daughter, Toby's sister, is not well. She is described as unstable. We would now say she's bipolar. By the end of the book, she's heavily dosed up on lithium. And part of Nick Guest's job is to keep an eye on her because at the start of the book, the thing that she's known to do is to cut herself. So he's a minder, he's a guest, he's also a kind of ornament. They all know he's gay, he's good looking, he's charming. They think he'll be useful. He's a nice guy to have around for dinner parties. He's very good with old women. He's very good with posh women. He's polite. He's a bit naughty. They think he's going to be fun. By 1987, this has all gone wrong. By the time of the second election, he and Catherine are watching it. Catherine is the daughter, on TV. And she says, and this is something I talked to Robert Saunders about, the weird language of the landslide. Can you have two in a row? She says, I thought it was a landslide last time. We had that book about it. Yes, it was, said Nick. She stared at the screen, where the famous swingometer was virtually at rest. But nothing's changing, she said. I mean, there's 2 more Labour seats. That's not a landslide. Oh, I see, said Nick. Then he goes on, it's a dead metaphor, darling. It just means a crushing victory. And then he sums it up. I mean, the land did slide once, as we all know, and it looks very much as though it's going to stay slidden. The first one was the landslide. That was 83. 87, the land is slidden. First time, it was movement. Second time, it was confirmation that something is now fixed. And that in many ways is the story of this novel. It takes place between these two events, the landslide and the land being slidden. The first time round, no one knows what it means. Everybody is feeling their way. At one point, one of the characters says of the Thatcher government post-1983, particularly the men around her, she is surrounded by men, a dominant woman, but almost all the rest of them are men, that they look like a bunch of men who have got away with something. The first Thatcher term, in many ways, had been a disaster, apart from the Falklands War. And this character says, the country's in a terrible mess. There are 3 million people unemployed. Nothing works. The economy looks like it's screwed. And these people have been re-elected with a massive majority. It's like they're concealing some dirty secret. Like, we got away with that? So now what are we allowed to do? If we could get away with that, maybe we can get away with anything. And it has this giddy feeling at the start of the book that everybody has a sense that nobody knows what the new rules are. By 1987, the rules are established. These people are now in power. They have been in power for nearly a decade. They are clearly going to be in power for longer than a decade. This is now their world. In 83, they're all looking around amazed and saying, oh my God, is this actually our world now? By 87, what was unknown and unexplored is the new terrain. The land slid, and now the land is slidden. That's the framing of this book. In the episodes for this series that I recorded about Middlemarch, I said in the first of those to imagine the time gap between the publication of Middlemarch and the time when it was set, to imagine a book written roughly now about the early 1980s, and how that would be a world that we would recognize, that would be familiar to some of us in our memory, maybe even only as children. But it wouldn't be remote. It wouldn't feel like history, but it would feel like the earlier time. The early 1980s was before so many things that not only do we now take for granted, that have completely shaped the way that we live, above all, the digital revolution. So The Line of Beauty is not that book, because The Line of Beauty was published 20 years ago from now, and it is set 20 years before it was published. So there's a 20-year gap between the action and the publication, and we are now 20 years on. So for us, this book is somewhere in the middle of that. It doesn't fit that model that I suggested of the classic 40-year gap. People often say 40 years is the gap of the great novels. War and Peace, set 40 years before it was published. This is a 20-year gap, which is very different. It's much narrower. It's much more in living memory of most readers. I mean, the readers who aren't children, all of them are going to have some memory of it. Yet it does have some of that feel to it, because even 20 years post when this book starts, 1983, is long enough to place it in the before time, particularly in relation to the coming technology. So just as in Middlemarch, there are the intimations of the railways. People are aware that the railways are coming. They see surveyors walking the land with their measuring poles. They have a feeling that everything is going to change, but no one has actually travelled on a train. I think no one in Middlemarch has been on a train when the action starts. In The Line of Beauty, there's a sense that everything is changing in 1983, including the beginnings of a change in the way in which the world of communication and information is going to work. But it hasn't happened yet. This is still the old time. This is still the old world. So one of the characters, not in 83, but in 86 in this novel, acquires this thing that astonishes his friends. He's a young man. He's a young man about town, a would-be businessman. He is one of Nick Guest's gay friends. In fact, at this point, he's his boyfriend. And he's living a life of quite wild, anonymous gay sex, in which there's a lot of picking up of men and giving fake names. And no one really knows in that world exactly who anyone is. And so in order to identify this guy, one of the things he is known as is he's the one with the portable telephone. He's the only one. It's not a mobile telephone. It is a portable telephone. That's what it's called, because he literally carries it around like a piece of luggage. And people are amazed by it. They're amazed by the possibilities of it, though it is heavy and inconvenient. At another point, two of the characters fight over a fax machine. One of them is the man with the portable telephone, and he's on holiday with another wealthy businessman, and they're both expecting faxes to arrive, and they both think that their faxes are the most important. And they're terrified. What if the faxes arrive at the same time and the machine can only print one? Whose fax will be printed? It's another time. Another character, in order to signal that he is serious when someone asks him what he's doing, and he says, actually, what I'm doing is I'm going to write a novel. And to show that he's not just one of those people who says he's going to write a novel but doesn't actually mean it, he buys what he calls a computer, one of these things that shows that you've got to be serious, because after all, why else would someone have a computer? It's like the railways in Middlemarch. It's coming, it's there. People see people on the landscape with these objects, but almost no one has experienced it. And most of the action, particularly in the early part of the book, takes place by the time frames and the rhythms of the analog world. The book begins with Nick Guest in London as a young gay man wanting to experience gay life. He's fantasized about it, but the implication is he's never actually had sex at this point. Having left Oxford, he's just dreamt about it. And the first thing that he does is he answers a Lonely Hearts ad. and he meets a guy who's older than him, and quite early on in the book, they begin a relationship. But the rhythm of that encounter is nothing like the world that is to come. It is an ad in the paper. It has to be responded to by letter. So you send in a letter. You have no idea if your letter's going to be read, if it's going to be seen. You have no idea if the person you're responding to is going to hear from you. You can exchange photographs, so at least you get the possibility of seeing what the other one looks like. And then you just have to wait. He waits for the response. And then you have to hope that the person calls you up on not the portable telephone, but the fixed telephone in the house that you're staying in. You hope that the person who answers it passes on the message. It's almost a miracle that these two meet up. They do meet up, but then they don't see each other for 3 weeks and they have no means of contacting each other. And when they see each other again, it's because one of them comes round to the other one's house and knocks on the door. Indeed, the new boyfriend, who's older than Nick and is also black, and this is a world where prejudice is just below the surface all the time, comes round to the house of the Tory MP and knocks on the door. And everybody has to smile and think like this is the most natural thing in the world. But it's also clear that everyone is absolutely on edge. That's communication. This guy is trying to reconnect. All of this takes place in the before time. So it has that Middlemarch feel to it. It's about the time just before the time that is our time. That said, this book is quite explicitly not Middlemarch. Indeed, Alan Hollinghurst has quite a lot of references in this book to late 19th and early 20th century fiction. He is a connoisseur of that fiction, and he makes absolutely clear what kind of a book this is. It's not Middlemarch. George Eliot features a couple of times. She gets 2 name checks in this novel. The first time is in 1986. Gerald Fedden's wife, Rachel Fedden, is looking at a copy of The Face magazine. So The Face, at this point, is cutting edge, this edgy, funky magazine, which the young people are reading. And here's a middle-aged woman, the wife of a Tory MP, belongs to one of her children, giving it that one eyebrow look and asking, what is this? And on the cover is Boy George. And so her kids have to explain to her what's going on here with Boy George. And they have to explain to her that the thing about Boy George is that he looks like a girl, but he's actually a boy. And her frame of reference for that is to say, okay, I think I get it. So it's not like George Eliot, because George Eliot was a girl pretending to be a boy, and this is a boy pretending to be a girl. And they go, yeah, mum, that's right. It's not George Eliot. This is not George Eliot's world we're living in. This is Boy George's world. At another point, Nick Guest goes back home and he sees his old bedroom, and his old bedroom has the relics of his previous life. So his previous life was as a young gay man living in the provinces outside of London in Middle England, in a kind of Middlemarch world, leading a life where he dreamt of exotic sex and the glamour of London, but he's not experienced any of it yet. At Oxford, he gets closer to it, but he never quite experiences it. And this is the bedroom of the sixth former, the student, and it contains what he calls the relics of his previous life, the life before he came to London. And among those relics is a dog-eared, spine-broken Penguin Classics copy of Middlemarch. That's what he used to read. He's not reading it now. The Line of Beauty is not Middlemarch. It's not provincial. It's not Tales of Provincial Life. This is London. This is the glamour. It's not panoptic in the way that Middlemarch is. The Line of Beauty is seen almost exclusively through the eyes of this one character, Nick Guest. It's his world. He's not interested in weaving it all together. He has no interest in how everything connects. He is interested in his own experiences. In some ways, you could say this novel is more like Trollope, because actually the setting is very similar. It's set in the home of a backbench MP. It's about the life of a backbench MP, an ambitious backbench MP like Phineas Finn. Gerald Fedden arrives in Parliament. He wants to make a name for himself. He's talked up as the coming man. People say he'll be in the cabinet by the next election. He needs to get close to the Prime Minister. He needs to connect with the people of power. It's not set in Parliament. We never go anywhere near Parliament, really. It's in the homes of these people. It's the domestic background setting of high politics, which is what Trollope did. And for some people, what he did so well, he managed to marry what goes on behind the scenes with what happens on the public stage. Again, Just in a couple of references, Alan Hollinghurst makes clear he is not trying to do Trollope. Nick Guest finds himself in a grand house talking to a posh man who wants to talk to him about Trollope and says, "Do you like Trollope?" And Nick Guest says, "No, I don't. I'm a Henry James man." And then he quotes to this old buffer what Henry James said about Trollope. And what Henry James said about Trollope was, of Trollope, his great, heavy shovelfuls of testimony to constituted English matter. The weight of Trollope, the intricacy, Trollope's interest in how things work, the great shovelfuls describing the way that England is constituted, literally constituted. He's fascinated by the workings of the parliamentary system. Nick Guest could not care less, and one suspects Alan Hollinghurst could not care less about the constituted matter of political life. When people say to Nick Guest, "What are you interested in?" he says he's interested in beauty. He's an English literature student. He's come to London to do a PhD. He's doing his PhD on style in Henry James. That is not shovelfuls of constituted matter. It's about the surface of things, and he worships Henry James. In this book, people refer to Margaret Thatcher as the lady, and they refer to Henry James as the master. And Nick worships the master. He worships the intricacy of his understanding of high English life, but his fascination with the surface of things and with things. The other thing that Nick Guest says he's interested in is not people, but things. And by things, he basically means furniture and paintings, but particularly furniture. He's fascinated by chairs, beautiful chairs. They need to be beautiful. And he could spend all of his time describing the surface of a piece of fabric. He has no interest in describing how a debate works in the House of Commons. This is a Henry Jamesian novel. He discusses Henry James in the book now and then to these Tories who talk to him, and they all want to pretend they're better read than they are, so a lot of them pretend they've read Henry James when they hadn't. But he knows of one of the criticisms that's often made of Henry James. Henry James wrote about rich people. He wrote about English aristocrats. He wrote about wealthy Americans and the collision between the two, between the Europeans and the Americans, but at the high end of society. And one of the critiques of Henry James is, though he wrote a lot about moneyed people, he didn't actually understand money. He didn't really understand how it worked, where it came from, what you had to do to make it. Trollope understood about money. What many people now consider Trollope's greatest novel, The Way We Live Now, is all about how you make, how you lose, and how you conjure out of nothing wealth. Nick Guest is absolutely clear. He also, as a follower of Henry James, is not interested in money. He lives in this novel surrounded by money. Gerald Fedden is rich. The house in Notting Hill, where he is staying as a guest, as a minder, as an ornament, is full of beautiful things, and he loves it. He goes to stay in country houses, which are even fuller of even more beautiful things. Some of the people that he hangs out with are spectacularly rich. Some of them become very rich during the Thatcher period. And he just doesn't, it's not that he doesn't care, because he benefits from it. In fact, he knows, of course he knows, that a lot of this beauty depends on this money that now somehow seems to be freely circulating and multiplying. And he acquires some of it. He's given some of it. He gets a check for £5,000 from one of his boyfriends, and he invests it, and it turns into more money. But he doesn't understand how it happens, and he's not interested in understanding. At one point, he talks about this thing that he's heard about called the Big Bang, which was the Thatcherite revolution in the City of London. And he's aware that all the people around him are really excited about it. They're almost rubbing their hands with glee. So this is good news for him, because he likes the people around him to be excited. And when there's excitement, there's drama, and he likes the drama. And these people seem to be getting rich. He has no idea what the Big Bang is. Towards the end of the novel, he finds himself in a fancy restaurant in London drinking a cocktail with some seedy friends. And the cocktail is called Black Monday. And it's a celebration of Black Monday, the great stock market crash, but from which these people have already rebounded. And the cocktail is described as tasting like an expensive laxative. He doesn't care how these people make their money. And yet he knows deep down that even though he can get away with not caring, he is dependent on them, because the things that he likes, the things that he values, the things that he wants to write about are in their world. And their world is built on their power and their money. And so if he doesn't understand it, all he will ever be in it is something floating on the surface. The book is divided into three parts. The action takes place at three times. There is the 1983 section, the first landslide, then 86, then 87. In the 1983 section, it's clear that everyone, not just Nick, but also his host, Gerald Fedden, and the people around him, are feeling their way in this new world. A new world has been arrived at. It is now Thatcher's world. This is the age of Thatcherism. But everybody is feeling their way and trying to work out what this means. What did we get away with? What will we get away with now? Already, right from the beginning, there's a sense that everybody is teetering on the edge of a new recklessness. The recklessness of people who have got away with something. The politicians have got away with something. And so Nick feels, well, it's enough time spent dreaming about having sex with men. It's time for him to start doing it. He needs to live this life, even though he knows it's going to be risky. And part of the risk of it is that he is an ornamental gay man in the house of a Tory MP, a straight Tory MP, but that's not the issue here. The issue here is this is the age of Thatcherism. It's one thing to be an ornament. It's another thing to be having sex with men in this man's home. It starts with him having sex for the first time with another man, with his new boyfriend, Leo, not in Gerald Fedden's home, but in his garden in Notting Hill. But it's not actually his garden. So he goes on this first date. They come back. They need somewhere to go. They can't go back to Leo's place because he lives with his mum and his mum doesn't know he's gay. They can't go back to Nick's place because Nick lives with a Tory MP who knows he's gay but doesn't want him having sex in his house. But Nick has a key to the communal garden in Notting Hill. And this is exactly that same kind of communal garden that features in the film Notting Hill. Anyone who's seen Notting Hill will remember that Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts, when they're on their first date, though they don't, I think, end up having sex in the garden, climb over the fence because they don't have the key to this garden. But in these Notting Hill squares, all of the houses around share a common ownership of this space. To get into it, you need to be a resident in one of these houses. So it's only the people with the keys who can get in. And because Nick is living in this house, he has a key. So he takes Leo into this magical space, like in Notting Hill. There are other people there. It's a shared space. So this isn't secure. This isn't a private space. They're doing it in public, but they have to find a private bit, an obscure bit hidden by a tree. And that's what they do. And then when they're done, one of Gerald Fedden's neighbours spots Nick with a black man in this Notting Hill garden. This is 1983. And as a reader, one fears the worst. And he comes up to him and says, "What the hell are you doing here?" And Nick says, "It's all right, I'm a key holder." And this man says, "Oh, whose house? How do you have a key?" Looking suspiciously at the other man who's there. And Nick says, "Well, I'm staying with Gerald Fedden." At which point this man goes, "Splendid. Oh, how wonderful. Oh, you must tell Gerald how delighted we all are that he's been elected. Great things. Oh, welcome to the neighborhood. Welcome to you all. This is wonderful. You're a key holder." And being a key holder is one of the motifs of this book. Nick is a key holder. He has the key to the magic garden. But of course, he also isn't a key holder because he has it on sufferance. The tension in that scene is the thought that this man might say, "Yes, but it's not your house, is it? So who the hell are you and who the hell is this?" But no, the magic words Gerald Fedden are enough for him to say, we all want to be part of that party. In the first part of the book, there are two ghosts at the feast of this novel, two things that are much discussed in the background or implied or hinted at, but almost never named. One of them is Margaret Thatcher. So Margaret Thatcher is in everyone's minds. Gerald Fedden thinks about almost nothing else. It used to be said that everyone in Britain at some point or another had a dream about the Queen. This is a period where, in this world at least, everybody is dreaming about Margaret Thatcher. Gerald Fedden is in love with her. Everyone talks about her as a cross between a queen and some kind of divinity. They talk about her extraordinary intelligence, her remarkable kindness, the breathtaking courage that she showed in the Falklands. They worship her, but she's not there. There are always hopes that maybe she'll come. Someone will throw a party and will the lady be there? They don't name her. She is she, or she is her, or she is the lady. When Nick goes to visit Leo's mum doesn't know that Leo is gay. Leo's mum is a very Christian woman. It's a very, very awkward encounter. Leo is introducing Nick as his friend, not his special friend, just his friend. Everyone knows what's going on. No one can say what's going on. It's miserable. But when she hears that Nick is living in the house of a Tory MP, she says, "Have you met her? Have you met her?" And Nick at this point still isn't totally sure who people mean when they say her. And she says, "Who?" And she says, the lady. And I think for the only time in the first part of the book, almost, she's named, not literally, Mrs. T. But Mrs. T is never actually there. She's just dreamt about, longed for, hankered after, desired, revered. The other ghost at the feast is AIDS, the spectre of AIDS. And in the first part of the book, AIDS is never named. This is 1983. There is no discussion of it. All that we get are just occasional glimpses that some of the men that Nick is meeting in his new London life are sick. We're never told what's the illness. No one discusses it. Everyone at this point is being, if this is the right word, discreet. When he first meets Leo, and then there's a gap before he sees him again, and then when he meets Leo again, Leo says, "Sorry, I've been a bit poorly." And we know, Nick doesn't know, but we know what that might mean. Leo takes Nick to meet his old boyfriend, the guy he used to be with. He's no longer with him. This guy lives in Portobello Road. He's an antique dealer, like Nick's parents are provincial antique dealers. But this guy is ill. He's seriously ill. And people just say, poor him, the chap is sick. He's a sick guy. Nothing else is said. These two things, Thatcher and AIDS, hover in the background of this book from the beginning, but they are unspoken. And they seem to have nothing to do with each other. At this point, there is no discussion in Gerald Fedden's home about AIDS. This is not yet the time where the Thatcher government has to do something about this disease and does some terrible things. And this is not yet the time when the Thatcher government then decides to take a stand about the teaching of the normality of homosexuality. None of that has happened yet. Thatcher and AIDS at this point have nothing to do with each other. But in this book, they are going to come together. And the connection between them is going to be Nick Guest. The second part of the book is 1986. So by 1986, everyone is much more secure. Gerald Fedden is a minister. He's in the Home Office. So he's on the way up. He's not in the cabinet yet, but things are going well. People seem to be richer. The Big Bang has happened. There seems to be a lot more money around. London feels fuller of money. People aren't talking about this country being broken. They're talking about this country being on fire. Nick is also much more secure. He's now been in this house for 3 years. So what is he now? He can't be a guest anymore. He's still keeping an eye on Catherine. He's not so much friends with Toby. He's almost a member of the family. No one quite knows what to call him, but he's always there. They're hoping he'll come to the dinner parties. He's still charming the posh old ladies. And he's living the full London life. There is a lot of sex. There is an awful lot of cocaine. He's living with and around people who, having got away with something, are now determined to go further. It's a reckless life. It's already clear this is a reckless life he's leading. He is, after all, taking cocaine in the house of a Thatcherite Home Office minister. What could possibly go wrong there? He's having sex with his boyfriend, but also he and his boyfriend are picking up other men to have sex with. And it's anonymous, it's reckless. AIDS is now being spoken about and discussed. People talk about being careful, being safe, taking precautions, but it feels like a life being lived right on the edge of safety, of security. There is cocaine everywhere. These people are dependent on it. Nick is still doing his PhD. He still believes in Henry James and beauty, but God, this is a lot seedier than it was. It feels a lot less beautiful, though his boyfriend is more beautiful than the previous one. And it feels very, very precarious. And even Gerald's life, it feels gilded and precarious. This is, after all, politics. Nothing is secure. And yet the moment in this part of the book where Nick gets a glimpse that actually this life that he's built for himself, which is in many ways the life that he dreamt of, and he's really enjoying it, though he often feels a bit seedy himself, he loves it. The glimpse he gets that it might all be about to shatter is not any of the wild stuff that he is doing. It's not some of the wildness around the Thatcher project by this point. It's not a moment of hubris. It's not a moment of coke-fueled excess. It's when he goes home, back to the provinces, because, and it's purely, we're told, by chance, this is not the reason that he's in Gerald's house, but his parents, his dad running the antiques business, live in Gerald's constituency, which is in the Midlands. And he has no interest in his constituency. At one point, someone says of Gerald Fedden, the thing that would make him really happy as a politician is if he didn't have to represent anywhere. He can't bear having to have constituents going back for constituency surgeries, having to pretend to take an interest in these people, going to the village fair. But he's a politician. He has to get elected. He does occasionally go back, and he goes back with Nick, and they visit Nick's parents. And on this journey, Gerald takes his secretary, a woman who's a kind of family joke among the kids, a capable woman who looks after her boss, looks after his diary. He's clearly dependent on her. She sort of runs that part of his life for him, not the social part of his life, but the political part of his life. So it's entirely understood that when he goes on a constituency visit, he'll take his political secretary, Penny, with him. No one really believes in Penny as a real person. She's like an avatar for them. And Nick gets a glimpse out of the corner of his eye, a scene when they think no one is watching, when Penny has her hand in the back pocket of Gerald Fedden's trousers. Not, we've had many, many scenes in this book where people are putting their hands in far more intimate places than that. This is simply a gentle hand in the back pocket. And that's the moment of chill. He doesn't know. Does it mean they're having an affair? He's not sure. He doesn't really think of Penny as a sexual person. He thinks of Gerald as a sexual person. He quite fancies him. But he doesn't know. He doesn't really know what it means. It's affectionate, but it has a hint of something much more intimate than that. So he's having an affair. Does it matter? What does it signify? And yet from that moment, there is a sense, a glimpse. It's like the crack in the windscreen, just the little chip in the windscreen. And you could go along for a long time, driving away. It's just at the corner of your vision. You can hardly see it. You're probably aware it's there. You go over a bump and the whole thing shatters. It's not the coke. It's not the lashings of gay sex. It's not at this point the AIDS. It's not the increasing corruption that seems to be swirling around these kinds of politicians on the make in the era of the Big Bang and of the high point of Thatcherism. It's not any of that. It's a woman's hand in a man's back pocket. It's the beginning of the end. But before we reach the beginning of the end, there is a scene in the second part of the book which is one of the great scenes in all political fiction. I think it is. I can't claim to have read enough books to back this up, but I instinctively feel it is the greatest fictional account of a real-life prime minister. Because in 1986, the high point for Gerald is that he throws a party in his grand Notting Hill house. It's his 25th wedding anniversary. He invites all the bigwigs that he can. It includes the Prime Minister. She has never as yet come to one of his parties, but she comes to this one. She accepts. More than that, she shows up and she stays. And Nick Guest, Alan Hollinghurst via Nick Guest, describes the experience of these people encountering Margaret Thatcher at the absolute height of her powers. These are people, not Nick Guest himself, but her host, the MP, and all the MPs, the other MPs he's invited, and their wives and their hangers-on. These people revere and worship this woman, and she comes to their party. It contains some unforgettable lines, single-sentence descriptions of a real person, which once read slightly changed the way that you might think about her. This is Alan Hollinghurst via Nick Guest describing the arrival of Margaret Thatcher at this party. She came in at her gracious scuttle, with its hint of a long-suppressed embarrassment, of clumsiness transmuted into power. The description of this scene is more like something from Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, with Thomas Cromwell, Nick Guest, Alan Hollinghurst as the wry observer of power and how it works, and the relationship between the appearance of power and the reality of power. They treat Margaret Thatcher at this party like a queen. She's described as like a queen. At one point, someone says of her, she's like the Queen, isn't she? And another person says, yes, but she's dressed more like a country and western singer. And then Nick Guest says, what really strikes me about this party is the queenery of the men around her. He says, I mean the queenery of the heterosexual men. Look at the way being around this woman more or less makes them gay for a night. And like a queen, like an absolute monarch, everything has been laid on for her. Everybody has to pretend to be natural. They're all wetting themselves with excitement, but they know it's not good for appearances to be seen to be doing that. They have to not play it cool, but try and be funny and charming and a little risque. They all want to be a little bit daring with her. They take it in turns to sit next to her on the sofa and be a bit flirty, not very successfully. And for her, this is all a world that's been created for her, and yet it's now become her reality. Here's another description of Margaret Thatcher at this party. She moved in her own accelerated element, her own garlanded perspective. She noticed nothing, and yet she remembered everything. It is the life of a monarch. And as all of these men, some of whom are in her cabinet, some of whom are hoping to be in her cabinet, some of whom are just hoping that she'll notice them, circle around her, none of them quite hitting the mark, Nick goes off to have another line of cocaine. So he's taking cocaine in a house that contains Margaret Thatcher, but not just Margaret Thatcher, but also serious numbers of armed policemen. And then, fortified by his line of cocaine, he comes back to the party and he thinks, well, I'll take a chance on this too. So he goes and sits next to her on the sofa. He's still a good-looking, charming young man. He's very good with older women. And he says to her, Prime Minister, would you like to dance? And she says, I would love to dance. And so to the horror, astonishment, awestruck envy of everyone else in the room, he takes her by the hand and leads her to the dance floor. And they dance. And it's clearly going to be one of the most memorable moments in his life. It doesn't last long because when his host and his landlord sees that Nick is dancing with the Prime Minister, he butts in and says, enough of that. And Gerald gets 10 minutes of dancing with Margaret Thatcher. And that is the high point of his life. I mean, it's clear at the time it's never going to be any better than that. But Nick has enabled it. Nick was the only one with the courage to ask her to dance. It is the centerpiece of the whole book. It's the thing around which the story seems to cohere. And yet it means nothing. Even at the time, it's clear it means nothing. And then the dance is over and she leaves. It was just a dance. They danced with the Prime Minister. So what? Someone has taken a photograph of Nick dancing with Margaret Thatcher, and it ends up on the wall of his loo, because that's where you put photographs like that. They're funny. They're a bit boastful. It meant nothing. It meant everything, and it meant nothing. And then by 1987, the final part of the book, the thing that had seemed secure but dangerous is now unraveling. Gerald has to defend his seat. He's not a good constituency MP. The constituents have seen through him. It's another landslidden event. He should be safe. He should increase his majority. He just squeaks in. That's the first sign that he's in trouble. Stories start to circulate around him. There are sniffs of him appearing in the press with a rumor that he's been involved in insider trading. There's the beginning of a financial scandal, though the thought is he can brazen it out by that point. Financial scandals are two a penny and the public aren't that interested. Nick's life is also becoming much, much more insecure. His boyfriend, the guy with the portable phone, who is the son of an extremely wealthy businessman, Lebanese immigrant, lives in Finchley, friend of Margaret Thatcher, donor to the Conservative Party, hoping to be ennobled. His son is Nick's boyfriend, though he has a fake female fiancée. And that boy, Nick's boyfriend, has got AIDS and is dying. Leo's sister comes to the house to see Nick, to tell him that Leo has died and that she's going through his contacts book and contacting all of his former lovers to tell them to get tested. Nick's world has gone from being dangerous to being lethal. Gerald's world still looks like it ought to be intact, but it's not, because his daughter Catherine, the one that Nick is meant to be keeping an eye on, knows about his affair with Penny, allows the press to discover it, and the press are interested now in the scandal. not interested in the insider dealing scandal. They are interested in the scandal of the Tory MP. It's a familiar scandal. It's all too familiar, but the Tory MP having an affair with his secretary. It's still probably not enough to destroy him. But then someone puts 2 and 2 and 2 together and gets the jackpot, because they also discover that living in Gerald's house is a young man that no one's ever heard of called Nick Guest, who is the boyfriend of the son of a Tory donor, and that son is dying of AIDS. And then the floodgates open and they hear about the cocaine. They hear about the drug taking. They hear about this life and they locate it in the house in Notting Hill. So now the headlines go from being somewhere buried on the business pages, rumours of insider trading, to somewhere nearer the front pages, Tory MP in affair with secretary, to blazoned all over the tabloids, AIDS and cocaine scandal in Tory MP's house. And the press descend on the house. And in one scene, they invade the garden, the private garden that is shared by all of the inhabitants of this little bit of Notting Hill, and they put up their ladders so that they can photograph into the house. And one of the locals goes up to them and demands, outraged, "Are you key holders?" As though it matters anymore who is a key holder and who isn't. They are camped outside and they're going to destroy him. And he has to resign. And this is a book in which, until this point, these conservatives, these Tories, these Thatcherites, these wealthy people, these unscrupulous, ruthless people, have been leading lives where prejudice is always just one breath away. And they hint at it all the time. There are endless hints of racism and anti-Semitism. People are described as, having good manners for a Jew, that kind of thing. At that party that Margaret Thatcher attends, one of the women who's hired to serve the drinks is black. And it's said of her, she was black, and Nick had noticed already the flickers of discomfort and mimes of broad-mindedness as she moved through the room and gave everyone what they wanted. These people are a breath away from expressing their anti-Semitism, their racism, their homophobia, but they don't, because they know, even though they've built this new world now and it's their world, they can do what they like with it. It's bad form. Better to have an ornamental gay man being nice to the Dowager Duchesses. But when it all goes wrong, when the chip in the windscreen shatters, the prejudice comes roaring to the surface, and the things that are said can never be unsaid, and they are the things that are felt and meant. And Nick is told by Gerald, and by worse people than Gerald's appalling Tory MP colleagues, that it's all his fault, and it's his fault because he's gay and because he is what gay people are. And he's told what gay people are a menace. They're a menace not just because of AIDS. So some of this prejudice is new prejudice, and some of it is very old prejudice. So they say to him, "What were you doing in this house anyway, you disgusting human being? How the hell did you inveigle your way into this decent house with your sex and your drugs? You're a typical gay man. You know that you can't have children. You'll never have a family. You can't get married. You know that your life is empty and shallow and meaningless. And so like all gay men, you latch onto real people with real families and real relationships. You're a parasite. You're a disgusting parasite." This is what they say to him. In the end, though Gerald is by no means the worst of them, this is what he says to him. And Nick goes in to say to him he's sorry, but it's not his fault. And they also blame him because they think that he should have kept their daughter under control, which is also outrageous. But before he can say, "I think it's time for me to leave," he's told, "You get out of this house and you never, ever come back." Gerald Fedden is clearly partly based on Cecil Parkinson. So Cecil Parkinson was the glamorous pin-up of the Conservative Party, close to Margaret Thatcher. He was thought maybe to fancy her. She was thought maybe to fancy him, who was undone by his relationship with his secretary. In his case, his secretary became pregnant, had the child, and that's when it unraveled, and Cecil Parkinson had to resign. He had, at that point in 1983, been tipped as Margaret Thatcher's successor. And Gerald Fedden's story echoes this in various ways. One of the ways in which it echoes Parkinson's story is that Parkinson was not destroyed by it. In the end, he came back. And not only did he come back, there was recently a fascinating documentary about Cecil Parkinson and Sarah Keyes, the secretary in this case, and the daughter that they had together, and the way in which Cecil Parkinson spent the rest of his long life, and he still had a long time to live, making sure that he used the power that he had, including the power of politics and the law, to control the narrative of what had happened, which essentially meant suppressing the ability of either Sarah Keyes or her daughter ever to discuss in public what had happened. And he pursued this campaign ruthlessly for decades, and he got away with it. And he came back into Thatcher's government. He returned to the cabinet. He didn't succeed her. That would never happen. And he became an establishment figure. He became chairman of the Conservative Party. He recovered from the scandal, and he recovered by using the power that he had accumulated to destroy the people who had brought him down in the first place. And there is a hint at the end of this book that this will be Gerald Fedden's fate. So he is at the point where the book ends, embroiled in scandal, financial scandal, sexual scandal on his own part. And also, he's had this man in his house who the tabloids are now presenting as part of the gay plague. And yet, at the end of the book, we are told that though he has resigned his ministership, he's just been offered a new business position, a new directorship. Whatever the financial scandal was, at least for some people in this world, it's a mark not of shame, but that he's someone that they can work with. There is a hint that he is now established enough in the world where the land is not sliding, it's no longer moving, it is slidden, that he can hold on to what he has and use it to rescue himself. It's not over for him any more than it was over for Thatcherism in 1987. She had just won another thumping victory. And men like him, will his marriage survive? We don't know, but I think probably. Will his political career survive? We don't know, but it sounds like maybe. Will his wealth survive? Yes, it sounds like, if anything, he's about to get even richer. He's going to be okay because this isn't 1983 anymore. In 1983, probably he was still vulnerable. By 1987, enough of what Trollope understood, and actually what George Eliot understood, even if Henry James and Nick Guest don't understand, enough of how power and money work is well understood by Gerald Fedden, well enough understood that he's going to be okay. For Nick, for the central character in the book, it's a brutal and miserable ending of his time in the gilded spaces of Notting Hill. He is no longer a key holder. He has to give the key back. And he is shaken, but he is not ashamed. He defends his corner. He feels the hatred coming off these people, and he almost relishes it. There are a couple of scenes in which he is almost high on the horror of the ways in which they express the hatred that they feel when the chips are down. He is not cowed by them. He gives as good as he gets. He is relatively powerless, and yet they can't really do anything to him. It's not like he's got a directorship to lose or a ministerial position to lose. He is by this point working on a fancy and vaguely fraudulent art museum and completing his PhD on style in Henry James. They can't destroy him. And in fact, like everyone else, he seems, without being able to understand how, to have been making money. It looks like he's going to be fine. He's profoundly bruised by this experience. He's also heartbroken because he thought these people were his friends. And though he knew that the people around Gerald Fedden and Rachel Fedden and Catherine Fedden and Toby Fedden, the four members of this family, with each of whom he has quite a deep relationship, though he knows the people around them are monsters, none of those four people he thought were monsters. Catherine is sick. Toby is his nice, superficial, straight friend. He thinks the mother, Rachel, actually is his close friend. And occasionally, of the four, she's the one that he describes as my friend Rachel. Partly because she's an outsider too. He's gay. She's a Jew. And even Gerald, he likes him. He likes his shamelessness. He likes his energy. He likes the way he gets away with things. This is a world in which Nick is also trying to get away with things. And so he's heartbroken. But he's not broken. He's just heartbroken. And also he's not allowing it to destroy what he thinks is valuable from his experience. And what is valuable from his experience is he has been surrounded by beauty. Beautiful people, some also incredibly ugly people, inside and outside. But beautiful things, beautiful houses, beautiful gardens, beautiful journeys, beautiful experiences, including on the drugs. The line of beauty is both in this book. It's many things. It's an architectural figure, and it's also a line of cocaine. and it has sexual connotations too. And he's enjoyed all of it, and he's experienced much of it as the best that life can be. And right at the end of the book, after this experience that would break most people, what he feels as he leaves Notting Hill is how much he loves both that life and life, the experience of being alive, the experience of sensation, not journalistic sensation, but sensation through the senses, the taste of things, the smell of things, the look of things, above all, the look of things, a beautiful sentence, a beautiful curve on a garden gate, a line of cocaine. And yet he knows what he knows at the end of this story, which is in a way the Trollope Henry James lesson, which is you can go a long way not understanding how money and power works. You can live among money and power and not understand how it works. You don't have to understand how it works to enjoy it, to benefit from it, to thrive under its conditions. After all, it's Nick Guest, presumably, because he doesn't understand how power works, who asked the Prime Minister to dance. Anyone who understood how power works wouldn't dare. There are many advantages, not to being naive. There's nothing naive about him by the end of this book. But there are many advantages to being deliberately blinkered or uninterested. And you can go a long, long way. But in the end, your fate will not be your own. You will be dependent. He's the key holder. He goes into the gilded space, but it's not his key. And he understands that, but he doesn't fully have control over the conditions under which he holds that key. And in the end, he discovers what he's always known, which is that to live in that world is not to have control over your own fate. Your fate is not your own. But then by the end of this book, for very different reasons, he knows that anyway. That's not, for him, the central instance of being at the mercy of a fate that you don't control, because the book ends not with Nick Guest taking an AIDS test, but Nick Guest on his way to take an AIDS test, and we are not told the result. To find out more about this series and this podcast, just visit our new website, ppfideas.com. Tomorrow, it's the penultimate fiction in our 15 Fictions for Summer series. I'm talking about Curtis Sittingfield's unforgettable reimagining of the marriage between George W. Bush and Laura Bush, American Wife.